Michael Reeves had never imagined that at 52 he would be starting his life over in a place that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. The old farmstead in Vermont had belonged to his father's side of the family, though for decades it had stood mostly abandoned, a skeletal reminder of a time when land meant survival, and barns echoed with the sounds of horses and work rather than silence. Michael, once a military engineer who spent the better part of 20 years designing and maintaining structures in places where dust storms carried more weight than seasons, had come back to the United States to find himself a widower, without children, without much purpose. His wife had died 3 years earlier after a sudden illness, and though Michael had always thought of himself as resilient, her absence hollowed him out in ways no battlefield or foreign assignment ever could. The house was modest and sagging at the edges, but the barn was vast, its red paint faded to a ghostly pink, the wood warped but sturdy, the kind of place that seemed to breathe with memory even when it was empty. When he first walked inside after receiving the keys, dust swirled like pale smoke in the shafts of afternoon light that cut through the cracks in the boards. He stood for a long time, hands in his jacket pockets, listening to the groan of beams shifting slightly above him, and he felt something he had not felt in years, a quiet certainty that he was standing in the middle of something that could be his. Again, something unclaimed by grief or bureaucracy or the endless forward motion of his old career. Michael was not a man who sought company. He had spent most of his professional life among soldiers and engineers, people bound together not by affection but by necessity, and in the years since retiring he had discovered that solitude did not frighten him. In fact, it steadied him. His late wife had been the social one, the connector, the woman who filled their home with neighbors, students from her college, stray cats that needed homes, while Michael sat contentedly at the edge of the gatherings, quietly fixing a broken clock, or cleaning his tools. When she passed, silence became the default, and although it was heavy, it was also safe. The barn, in its cavernous emptiness, seemed like an extension of that silence, a place where no one would demand anything of him, where he could finally devote himself to the meticulous craft of restoring antique timepieces, something he had once done in brief moments of leave overseas. He envisioned workbenches lined against the walls, drawers full of tiny gears, brass polished until it glowed, the kind of patient, detailed labor that asked nothing more than attention and rewarded him with the steady ticking of life measured in seconds. The land itself lay on the edge of the county, tucked between low hills and a stretch of forest that had not yet been claimed by developers. Most of the neighbors lived a good distance away, scattered along winding roads, the kind of rural setting where privacy was not just a right, but an unspoken agreement. Michael liked that. He liked knowing that when he closed his door at night, the only sounds he might hear were the wind in the trees or the faint call of an owl. He had no desire for the clamor of towns, no interest in festivals, no appetite for community meetings or shared projects. He had served a community larger than himself for decades. Now he wanted only to serve his own quiet hours. It was during those first weeks of moving in, unpacking what little he had kept after selling the house he once shared with his wife, that he began to notice Karen. She lived 2 properties down the road, in a large colonial house with flower beds arranged like military formations and a flagpole that gleamed as though it had been scrubbed daily. She was older than Michael by perhaps 5 years, with a blonde helmet of hair and the kind of sharp posture that suggested she had never in her life slouched in a chair. Their interactions were brief and polite. A wave when he passed by, a comment about the weather shouted from her porch, once even a basket of muffins left at his door with a note that read, "Welcome to the neighborhood, Karen." He had appreciated the gesture without feeling moved to reciprocate. He told himself it was because he valued his privacy, but deep down he sensed something performative in her smile, as though her kindness was less an act of generosity and more an audition for approval. For Michael, the barn was the heart of his new existence. Each day he rose early, made strong coffee, and walked the dirt path from the house to the barn as though it were a commute. Inside, he worked slowly, repairing the structure board by board. He replaced rusted hinges, cleared out nests of birds and mice, sanded the splintering wood of the doors until they opened smoothly. He imagined, in time, installing proper insulation, a heating system, perhaps even a lofted studio where he could spend winter afternoons bent over his tiny instruments. The work gave him routine, and routine gave him something close to peace. When neighbors drove past and glanced curiously at the property, he nodded without inviting conversation. When Karen stopped once to suggest he attend the local Heritage Committee meeting, he smiled and declined, saying he was busy. The barn, he told himself, was not just a structure. It was a fortress against the chaos of the world he had left behind, a monument to self-reliance, and a place that finally belonged to him alone. What he could not have imagined was how quickly that illusion would be shattered, how a neighbor's ambition and a single night of music would turn his sanctuary into a stage, and how 500 strangers would one evening fill the space he had, sworn would remain his private refuge. The night it began, Michael had been returning from town later than usual, his pickup bed heavy with lumber and supplies for the barn. The road that wound back to his property was quiet, a stretch of black ribbon broken only by the reflection of his headlights against the trunks of birch trees. It was late September, the air sharp with the first hints of autumn, and he had been content in the silence, thinking only of the small progress he would make the next day sanding beams and measuring the angles of new supports. Yet long before he reached his land, he sensed something was wrong. A low vibration pulsed faintly in the steering wheel, not mechanical, but external, a tremor that did not belong to the truck at all. As he crested the hill that overlooked his fields, the source revealed itself in the form of light. Not the soft glow of a porch or a neighbor's lantern, but a furious blaze of color that spilled from the cracks of his barn like molten glass. He slowed instinctively, his eyes narrowing as he took in the impossible scene below. The fields that had been empty for months were now lined with rows of cars parked haphazardly across the grass, their roofs glinting beneath the shifting hues of red, blue, and violet that bled from the barn. The low hum became a thunder of sound, a rhythmic pounding that rattled the glass of his windshield even before he rolled down the window. It was music, though not the kind he associated with the countryside. This was an industrial tide of bass and drums, a relentless pulse that made the earth itself seem to quiver. Michael pulled off the road, cutting the engine, and for a moment simply sat in stunned disbelief. From his vantage point he could see shadows moving in great numbers, bodies swaying, the outlines of people climbing from cars and converging toward the barn doors as though drawn by some magnetic force. At first he thought it must be a mistake, some local fair or festival that had been rerouted by error, but then the recognition struck cold. This was his barn, his private property, and at least 500 strangers were dancing inside it. He stepped out of the truck and the air hit him like a physical force, thick with the tang of spilled beer and exhaust. Voices rose in chaotic chorus. Laughter, shouts, the shrill cheer of young women, the low rumble of men talking too loudly, all of it woven into the overwhelming flood of amplified sound. He moved down the slope with the measured gait of a man still trying to believe what he was seeing, each step tightening the coil in his chest. As he neared the barn, he saw strings of lights stapled along the edges of the frame, rented generators humming beside stacks of crates, even a makeshift stage erected against the back wall where a band pounded furiously at their instruments. And then, above the frenzy, he heard a voice he recognized. Karen. She stood on the stage, not in the crowd but commanding it, one hand gripping a microphone, the other raised in theatrical gesture. Dressed in a flowing jacket that glittered beneath the lights, she looked nothing like the neighbor who had left muffins at his door. She was radiant with authority, her posture exuding the confidence of someone who believed entirely in her right to be there. "Welcome to our night of revival," she declared, her words carried on the sound system, crisp and amplified, cutting even through the distortion of the band. The crowd roared back in response, a wave of cheers that shook the rafters. "This is your space, this is our heritage, and tonight we take it back together." Michael froze in the shadow of the barn's yawning doors, his breath catching as her words sank in. Our heritage. Our space. She was speaking as though the barn, his barn, was some communal monument, as though his ownership were nothing more than an inconvenience to be erased by the sheer volume of collective celebration. He stepped forward, shoving past clusters of strangers who smelled of alcohol and perfume, his shoulders colliding with theirs as he tried to make his way to the stage. Inside, the air was suffocating, thick with heat and sweat and the sweet chemical sting of spilled liquor. People packed the floor wall to wall, their bodies moving in feverish rhythm, cups raised, feet stomping against the wood he had only days ago repaired with careful hands. A young man brushed against him and slurred, "Great party, man," before disappearing into the crush. Michael pushed onward, his jaw tightening, his hand clenching unconsciously into a fist. When he finally broke through enough of the crowd to be seen, Karen's eyes fell on him. For a brief instant her expression flickered. Surprise, annoyance. And then she smiled, bright and triumphant, as though his arrival were part of her performance. "There he is," she shouted into the microphone, pointing toward him. "The man of the hour, the keeper of the barn." A cheer erupted, hundreds of voices surging together, and Michael felt the floor tremble beneath their stomping. Show him your love, because without him, none of this would be possible. The crowd roared again, mistaking her proclamation for an introduction, and Michael felt a sick wave of realization. She had already woven a story in which he was complicit, in which his silence or protest would both serve her. He stepped forward, shouting over the din, his voice raw with anger. "This is my property. All of you need to leave now." But the words were swallowed in the torrent of sound, drowned beneath the music and the crowd's laughter. Karen tilted her head, mockingly cupping a hand to her ear as though she could not quite hear him. One of the so-called staff, a man in a fluorescent vest that bore no official insignia, appeared at Michael's side, his expression hard, his stance wide. "Back off, sir," he said curtly, his voice pitched low enough to be lost in the noise around them. "You don't want to ruin this for everyone." Michael stared at him, incredulous. "This is my barn," he spat. "You have no right—" But the man stepped closer, close enough for Michael to smell the stale coffee on his breath, and said, "Not tonight. Tonight, this belongs to them." The fury in Michael's chest burned hotter, but even as he opened his mouth to argue again, he knew he was outnumbered. 500 bodies pressed together, intoxicated, careless, caught in the fever of the moment. If he fought here and now, he would be the villain in their eyes, the bitter recluse who tried to crush their joy. He looked back to Karen, who raised her free hand in a grand gesture and shouted, "Let the music play!" The band thundered louder, the crowd surged, and Michael felt himself shoved backward, consumed by the living tide. He stumbled out into the night air, his ears ringing, his lungs desperate for clean breath. From outside the barn, the sound was no less overwhelming, a constant assault that pulsed across the fields like artillery. He staggered toward his truck, fury and disbelief mingling in his veins, and as he turned once more toward the barn, he caught Karen's figure silhouetted in the doorframe, one hand still gripping the microphone, her smile sharp as a blade. In that instant, he understood that this was no misunderstanding, no accidental use of his property. It was deliberate, orchestrated, and performed with the full confidence of someone who believed herself untouchable. What he could not yet grasp was just how far she had already gone to make that belief true. The morning after the concert, Michael walked across the field toward the barn with a heaviness in his chest that was not just fatigue, but something closer to dread. The kind of dread that comes when a man suspects that a line has already been crossed beyond repair. The grass was trampled flat in long ruts, Beer bottles and plastic cups glittered like debris from a storm, and cigarette butts lay smoldering in the damp soil, half buried in mud. His boots crunched over fragments of glass that had once been jars and bottles, and the sour tang of stale alcohol clung to the air. When he finally reached the barn doors, which he remembered closing himself only 2 nights before, he found them wide open, the hinges pulled hard enough that the wood was splintered where the screws had been torn loose. Inside, the devastation was worse. The floor he had so carefully swept and repaired was sticky with spilled liquor, and in the far corner one of the support beams had been cracked nearly in half, most likely from the weight of speakers or stage equipment. Scattered everywhere were the remnants of a night he had never agreed to host: tangled extension cords, crumpled flyers advertising Vermont Cultural Revival, and even a half-collapsed bar table littered with receipts, as if someone had been openly selling drinks under his roof. He stood in silence for a long while, the reality pressing into him heavier than any battlefield memory, heavier even than grief. This was not negligence, it was occupation. His barn had been transformed into something foreign, a monument to someone else's vision, and he had been pushed aside as though he were nothing more than a spectator. On the cracked wooden stage that had been erected against the back wall, a microphone still leaned against a stand, humming faintly with the static of a generator left running somewhere behind the building. He moved toward it and switched it off. The silence that followed so sudden and complete it rang in his ears. It was then, in that heavy stillness, that he noticed the flyer taped to one of the support beams. It bore the same slogan Karen had shouted into the microphone: "This is our space. This is our heritage." Beneath the words was a logo that looked official enough to fool the untrained eye, a crest surrounded by the phrase Cultural Trust of Vermont. At the bottom, in bold letters, was his own address, as if the barn had already been claimed not by him but by an organization he had never heard of. He took the paper and folded it with trembling hands, shoving it into his jacket pocket. Anger coursed through him, but beneath the anger lay something colder, the knowledge that this had not been spontaneous. The generators, the stage, the logo, the printed flyers, all of it spoke of planning, weeks of planning, maybe even months. Karen had not only chosen his barn but had gone to lengths to make the world believe it was hers to give away. Michael locked the barn as best he could and drove into town, the flyer burning in his pocket. At the municipal building he asked to see someone about property rights, his voice tight, his hands still dirty with the grime of the night before. The clerk, a young man who looked barely old enough to shave, clicked through his computer files with indifference until at last he frowned. "It says here the barn has been registered under a cultural use variance," he said, as if reading off the screen without truly understanding it. "Filed last month." Michael leaned forward, his voice low and sharp. "By who?" The clerk shifted uncomfortably, scrolling. "Karen Whitfield says she's acting as director for the Vermont Cultural Trust." He hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Michael. "There's a signature here. Yours." Michael's breath caught. "That's impossible. I never signed anything." The clerk turned the screen toward him, and there it was, a scanned form bearing his name in handwriting that looked eerily like his own, so close he might have doubted himself if he did not know the truth in his bones. The address was correct, the details specific, and even the signature carried the same slope of his letters, though when he looked closely he saw the differences: the sharpness of the R in Reeves, the angle of the M. Someone had copied him, studied his hand carefully enough to deceive an office, maybe even a court. He left the building with his jaw tight and his hands curled into fists, the edges of the flyer digging into his palm. When he returned to the barn that evening, the lock he had installed that morning was already broken. Inside, he found 2 men hauling away speakers, men he had never seen before, who looked at him with a mixture of impatience and scorn. "We're with the Trust," one of them said flatly, lifting a crate. "Karen told us to clean up. She said you'd understand." Michael stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "This is my property. You don't take anything out of here." The man smirked. "Then you better talk to Karen, because according to her, this barn belongs to the community now. You're lucky she let you stay on the land at all." They brushed past him, carrying equipment into a van with tinted windows parked outside, and for a long moment Michael stood alone in the wreckage, the weight of what he had just heard settling over him like a shroud. Lucky she let you stay. The arrogance in those words, the quiet implication that his ownership was already irrelevant, told him everything he needed to know. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a takeover. That night, as he sat in the silence of his kitchen, the barn dark and wounded across the field, he replayed every interaction he had ever had with Karen. The muffins at the door, the cheerful waves, the suggestion that he attend community meetings. All of it had been a prelude, a softening of the ground before the real work began. She had not been trying to welcome him. She had been preparing to erase him. He looked at the flyer again, the official-looking crest, the bold claim of cultural revival, and he knew she was not acting alone. There were others behind her, others willing to believe or pretend to believe that his barn had always been theirs to use. The first cracks in his solitude had appeared, and they were not small. They were wide enough for 500 strangers to march through, wide enough for forged signatures and stolen authority. And as he sat there, his hands still trembling, Michael understood that this was only the beginning. Karen had declared war, and she had done it in front of an audience large enough to make her lie seem true. The days after the first confrontation blurred together in a haze of restless anger and cautious calculation. Michael had always believed himself steady, a man trained to look at structures and systems, to see where a foundation held and where it would inevitably collapse. Yet now, standing in the half-ruined barn with splinters scattered across the floor and the scent of spilled alcohol still lingering in the wood, he realized that the structure under attack was not only the building itself, but his claim to it. The very idea that he had a right to this space, and that realization unsettled him in a way no battlefield or foreign deployment ever had. The barn had become both fortress and target, and he was no longer just a man repairing old beams, but someone being tested in a game he had not agreed to play. Karen, it turned out, had not been idle in the aftermath of the concert. Within a week, new flyers appeared in town, some posted brazenly on the notice board outside the general store, others slipped under windshields in the parking lot near the post office. They bore the same seal as before, though now rendered in sharper ink, as though someone had refined the design to make it look more official. The words proclaimed, "Second Revival Night, Vermont Cultural Trust, all welcome." Contribution suggested. At the bottom, again, stood the address of his barn. It was no longer even an invasion disguised as spontaneity. It was advertising, shameless and bold, an announcement that his home had been recast as a venue. He tore one of the flyers down, crumpling it in his fist, only to notice two young men watching him from across the street, with expressions that flickered between suspicion and contempt. One of them muttered something under his breath before turning away, and Michael felt the skin on the back of his neck prickle. The realization came to him slowly, but once it settled, it was impossible to shake. Karen was not simply hosting events, she was weaving a narrative in which he was the outsider, the interloper on land that had, in her telling, always belonged to the community. The false signature on the municipal papers was not a clumsy forgery, but part of a larger design, a tapestry of appearances meant to make her claim believable not through truth, but through repetition. If enough people believed the barn was already a cultural site, then his objections would look like selfishness, his protests like hostility. In the court of public opinion, truth mattered less than the volume of those repeating the lie. He turned to records, to whatever fragments of proof his father and grandfather might have left, combing through boxes of yellowed deeds and brittle letters kept in the attic of the farmhouse. Late into the night he sat at the kitchen table with a lamp burning low, sorting documents by hand. At last, he found it. A notarized deed, signed nearly 70 years earlier, clearly marking the barn and surrounding acres as part of the Reeves property. There were no easements, no clauses suggesting transfer, nothing that could be twisted into a communal claim. He placed the paper flat on the table, the ink faded but legible, and for the first time in weeks he felt the faint stirrings of ground beneath his feet. The barn was his by law and blood. That much was certain. With that certainty in hand, he went to see a local attorney, a woman named Claire Drummond, who had built a reputation for handling property disputes in the county. She listened quietly as he laid out the story, her brow furrowing deeper with each detail. When he slid the forged document across her desk, she studied it for a long time before exhaling sharply. "This is deliberate," she said at last, her voice measured. "Not amateur work. Whoever drew this up had access to municipal filing systems, maybe even help inside the office. That makes it harder, but it also makes it riskier for them. If we can trace the filing back, we can prove fraud." Her words steadied him, though the weight of what she implied pressed heavily. Karen was not acting alone. The forged documents, the crest, the filings, they required access, perhaps even complicity from within the town offices. It meant that his battle was not against a single neighbor with overblown ambition, but against a network that saw his barn as a prize to be seized. Claire promised to draft an injunction to halt any further events, though she warned him that the process might be slow. In the meantime, she urged him to document everything, the damage, the flyers, the intrusions, because once this moved to court, memory would mean nothing without evidence. Armed with her advice, Michael returned home with a camera he had not touched in years, not to capture beauty, but to create a record. He photographed the splintered doors, the cracked beam, the flyers stapled into the frame. He documented the ruts in the grass where cars had torn through the field and the discarded beer bottles stacked in corners. Yet, as he moved through the barn, cataloging the ruin, a deeper unease grew within him. This place that had once been his refuge was beginning to feel alien, transformed not only by damage but by the weight of other people's claims. Each photograph became less a record of property and more a chronicle of invasion, a testament to how easily ownership could be undermined by sheer audacity. The second concert drew nearer, the flyers promising music, food, even a raffle, to benefit the trust. Michael's attempts to confront Karen directly only sharpened the sense of her confidence. When he caught her outside her house one afternoon, she greeted him with the same dazzling smile she had worn on stage. "Michael, you really should relax," she said, her tone infuriatingly gentle, as though speaking to a child who had failed to grasp a simple lesson. "These events are for everyone's benefit. The barn was wasted space before, and now it's alive. Don't you want to be part of something bigger than yourself?" He stared at her in disbelief. "It's not wasted space. It's my space." Her smile faltered just slightly, and for a moment the steel beneath the charm showed through. "It's the community's now. You'll understand, eventually." Then she turned and walked back to her porch, leaving him with a sense that he had just spoken not to a neighbor but to a politician, someone who had already chosen the story she would tell and would not deviate, no matter what he said. The midpoint of the struggle came not with violence but with clarity. Standing in his kitchen late one night, the forged document spread before him, the real deed beside it, he realized the nature of the battle had shifted. This was no longer about simply repairing what was broken or demanding that intruders leave. It was about proving his existence as the rightful owner against a tide of illusion. Karen had claimed his barn as a stage, but more dangerously, she had begun to convince others that it had always been theirs. To resist her would mean not only protecting wood and stone, but defending his very identity as its keeper, and that was a fight he could not walk away from. He closed the deed gently, as one might close a sacred text, and whispered into the stillness of the room. "Not yours. Not ever." The words carried no audience, no applause, but they steadied him. The vow of a man who knew that his solitude had been invaded, and that the only answer was to confront the invasion head-on. The next phase, he understood, would not be a skirmish of words at the barn door, but a war fought in courts and offices, with signatures and records wielded as weapons. And in that war, he would have to be sharper, more patient and more relentless than the woman who had tried to erase him with a smile. In the week that followed the revelation of how far the fiction had spread, everything around the barn seemed to grow more deliberate and more brazen, as if the first concert had been a test of boundaries, and, finding no immediate wall to stop them, Karen and whoever stood behind her had decided to advance with the cheerful certainty of people who believed momentum itself could rewrite property lines. And so Michael woke each morning to a fresh layer of presumption laid across his land. First, the pallets stacked neatly by the field road with rental company stickers still clinging to their sides. Then the rows of portable toilets set down along the fence like a line of small blue sentries facing his house. Then a laminated schedule stapled to his gate that announced load in 0900, sound check 1300, doors 1800, written in clipped production jargon that ignored the fact that the gate it was stapled to belonged to him and not to their itinerary. And when he pulled the paper free and tore it in half, he found another copy already taped to the far post, as if redundancy were itself an argument. By midweek, a flatbed truck arrived with modular trussing, the kind used to suspend lights and speakers in venues that had actual insurance and occupancy limits, and 3 men in matching black jackets unloaded the pieces with the brisk indifference of crews who have performed the same motion in 100 different places, calling out measurements and hoisting aluminum while Michael stood in the doorway of the barn and said, again and again, that they did not have permission to be there, that there would be no event, that the structure was not rated for the weight they were about to hang from it. And the foreman, a rangy man with a nicked eyebrow and the permanent squint of someone who has spent too many years staring into stage haze, finally replied without looking at him that if the trust wanted a lighter rig, they would have booked one, and that if Michael had concerns, he should take them up with Karen because she was the one signing the checks, a sentence whose casual assumption of authority cut deeper than any insult. The rigging crawled upward anyway, piece by gleaming piece until the truss arced over the center, bay like a skeleton of some mechanical animal, and when a coil of cable swung and clipped the cracked support beam, Michael felt his stomach tighten, because the hairline fracture he had photographed 2 days earlier opened another whisper's width, and the thought of 500 bodies moving under that stress sharpened into something close to terror. Claire filed for an emergency order to halt all use of the barn pending the fraud investigation, and for a day Michael allowed himself to believe that paper might meet paper on equal terms, that a judge's signature could arrest the fiction the way a brace arrests a failing frame. But the earliest hearing the clerk could schedule was after the weekend Karen had splashed across her flyers, and when Claire pressed for something sooner, the answer came back in the neutral tone of official scheduling, that there was no one to hear it before Friday at 4, which left the space between now and then as open as a wound. Karen sensed as much because that afternoon she appeared at the end of his drive with 2 volunteers in bright lanyards and the manner of someone arriving to inspect a site rather than to request entry, and she spoke in the clipped, sunny language of event managers about traffic flow and emergency egress and community shuttles, as if the use of such words could conjure authority where none existed. And when Michael told her again that there would be no second night, she tilted her head with a look of pitying patience, as though he were refusing a kindness out of stubbornness, and said that resistance only inflamed people, that he would only make himself the villain, that it would be so much better if he came on stage for a minute and blessed the space. And he stared at her and thought of the forged filing and the cracked beam and the smell of gasoline that lingered in the dirt where generators had bled. And he said that the only thing he would bless was a court order, to which she smiled and said that courts were slow and culture was fast, and then she walked away while the volunteers measured the field with a long tape and made small hopeful noises about where to put a second bar. The neighbors began to split along lines that had not existed a month earlier, not exactly dividing into those who loved noise and those who loved quiet, but rather into those who had been charmed by Karen's narrative of revival and those who had looked at the barn and seen a man's work being overwritten, and Michael found himself in conversations he had never wanted to have on porches and at mailboxes, listening to soft-voiced arguments about community benefit and the myth of unused space, hearing himself described as a holdout and a spoiler, and, although a few people spoke in his defense, reminding anyone who would listen that ownership was not an abstract notion, but a responsibility backed by law and labor, the current still seemed to be flowing her way, because spectacle was seductive, and the promise of another night out was easier to hold in the mind than the fact of a deed stored in a courthouse drawer. On Friday morning, with the hearing hours away and the riggers already back to finish their grid, the weather broke in that abrupt New England manner that turns a blue sky to pewter in the time it takes to tighten a bolt, and rain began to drum on the barn roof with a persistence that made the truss sway almost imperceptibly, and Michael, who knew wood and load paths and the way moisture crept into fiber and turned strength into memory, climbed a ladder with a bottle jack and a cut length of oak to shore the cracked post, not because he had chosen complicity, but because he could not bear the thought of the beam failing beneath other people's bodies while he stood on principle. And when the foreman swore about lost time and shouted that the owner had no business interfering, Michael looked down and said very clearly that the only owner present was the man holding the jack, and then he set the oak and took the weight until the fracture closed by the width of a fingernail, and the men fell briefly silent in the presence of a competence that neither conceded nor performed. By the time he drove to the courthouse, the rain had settled into a gray curtain, the kind that makes towns feel smaller and authority feel far away, and they waited outside the courtroom until a clerk informed them that the judge was running behind, and then they waited longer while the weekend crept closer, and when at last they were called, the argument felt clean in Claire's mouth and tattered in the room, because she laid out the forged filing and the unauthorized use and the imminent risk to safety, while Karen's counsel, a man with perfect cuffs and an easy smile, spoke of public benefit and the tradition of barn dances, and the danger of letting a single person block an entire community's joy. And, though the judge did not look persuaded by nostalgia, neither did he relish the idea of issuing an order that would send deputies to a field to shut down a night of music. And so he did the thing judges do when pressure exceeds confidence and split the difference by forbidding entry to the barn proper, while pointedly declining to restrain ancillary outdoor activities. A phrase that landed in Michael's gut like a stone because it meant the field would still fill, generators would still growl, speakers could still be stacked on, temporary risers that flexed under weight, and nothing in the paper prevented Karen from using the barn as a backdrop while pretending it was not a venue. When Michael returned home at dusk, he found new signs planted along the road that read, "Community Gathering, Rain or Shine," the truss gleaming through the doors like a dare, the portable toilets multiplied, the blue boxes now marching farther down, the fence, and on his gate an envelope addressed in a careful hand containing a letter that thanked him profusely for lending his space to the trust, and enclosed a ceremonial plaque engraved with his name and the words, "Founding Steward," a gesture so audacious and so precisely calibrated to confuse the casual observer that he almost laughed before he felt the heat rise behind his eyes, because the plaque was the perfect instrument of erasure, a token that recast theft as generosity and turned the victim into patron. And as he stood in the rain with the metal plate heavy in his palm, he realized that the second escalation was not loudness or crowds, or even the creeping deformation of the beam. It was the transformation of meaning itself. The way words and objects were being arranged around him until the simplest truths, that he owned the barn, that he had not agreed, sounded like complaints against a festival rather than statements of fact, and he understood that if he lost this battle, it would not be because she had more force, but because she had more story, and so he carried the plaque into the kitchen, set it face down on the table, and began to prepare for a night in which he would have to guard his threshold not with spectacle but with endurance. The night of the second concert arrived with a heaviness in the air that felt almost biblical, as though the storm clouds gathering above had been summoned not by weather, but by the sheer weight of defiance and deception that had built in the weeks before. And as dusk fell across the fields, Michael stood at his window watching the first headlights snake their way down the road, car after car spilling onto his land as though it belonged to them, their tires flattening the wet grass, their laughter carried on the wind that whipped hard against the house. He had not slept the night before, not after the judge's half-measure that banned the use of the barn but allowed the ancillary activities, words that Karen had immediately twisted into permission, and so he had sat in silence through the dark hours, preparing himself for the reality that nothing short of confrontation would end this. By the time the first notes of amplified music rolled across the night air, vibrating the glass panes of the kitchen windows, Michael had already put on his coat, checked the folder of documents Claire had prepared, and steadied his hands with the slow discipline of a man who had spent too many years solving problems under pressure. The field blazed with light, generators roaring against the storm, and once again the barn stood illuminated like a monument, even though the judge had forbidden its use. The truss still arched over the central bay, festooned with spotlights, and, though the stage was technically set outside, the crowd spilled easily in and out of the barn doors, defying the restriction in a way so casual it mocked the very concept of law. Michael pushed through the throng, his presence drawing irritated glances and the occasional shouted insult, until he reached the temporary platform where Karen stood radiant and untouchable in her sequined jacket, her voice booming through the microphone as she declared the night a triumph of a community spirit. When she spotted him, her smile widened, and in a gesture calculated for spectacle she extended her free hand toward him as though inviting him into the performance, announcing to the cheering crowd that the steward of the barn had joined them. Again, words that twisted the truth until it bent entirely in her favor. But this time Michael did not stop in the shadows, nor did he allow himself to be swallowed by the tide of noise. He climbed the steps of the stage with a deliberate calm, ignoring the volunteers who tried to block his way, and when Karen turned as if to drape an arm around his shoulder, he stepped aside and pulled from his coat the deed, the injunction, and the photographs that showed the cracked beams and splintered wood. He did not raise his voice. He had learned long ago that in chaos the quietest sound could sometimes cut deepest, and into the microphone he said only that this barn was his, that the court had already forbidden its use, and that anyone who remained inside was trespassing on private property. For a moment there was only confusion, the crowd shifting uneasily, their cheers faltering as the words settled, and in that fragile silence Michael extended the folder outward where the nearest camera lights caught it in their glare. The officers who had been circling at the edge of the field chose that moment to move in, not because they were eager, but because the injunction gave them no more room for hesitation. And as they climbed the stage steps, Karen's expression finally cracked, the smile freezing into a mask that could no longer hide the fury beneath. She shouted into the microphone that this was theft, that Michael had betrayed the people. But her voice was drowned now not by music, but by the orders of law enforcement echoing across the platform. The band fell silent, their instruments ringing into stillness, and in that sudden quiet the spectacle collapsed into something raw and ugly. Volunteers scattering, the crowd muttering, some booing but others slipping away quickly, eager to avoid trouble. When the officers escorted Karen down the steps, she twisted once more to face the audience, her voice shrill as she insisted she was the victim, that she had been sanctioned by a trust to protect heritage, but the words rang hollow now against the visible documents, the broken lock still dangling from the barn door, the very evidence of her lies spread out under the floodlights. Michael stood rooted on the stage, exhausted and trembling but resolute, watching as the woman who had tried to erase him with performance and forged papers was led through the dispersing crowd, her sequins catching the light like shards of glass, and in that moment the barn behind him seemed to exhale, its silence finally reclaiming space from the noise that had stolen it. It was not victory in the jubilant sense, not yet. The damage remained, the fracture in the beam, the gouges in the floor, the field torn to ruts. But as the last generator sputtered down and the storm finally broke open, releasing rain that drenched the trampled grass and sent the remaining spectators hurrying to their cars, Michael felt a shift inside him, the understanding that he had stood his ground in the face of spectacle and not yielded. He had not won the war, not yet, but he had stopped the night, and that was enough to begin reclaiming what was his. In the weeks that followed, the memory of the storm-swept night lingered over the land like a scar, but slowly the noise receded and the barn began to return to itself. No longer blazing with lights or trembling beneath the stomp of strangers, but standing quiet again, its silence heavy yet dignified, as though grateful to be reclaimed. Karen faced charges of trespassing, fraud, and unauthorized commercial activity, and though she was released on bail, her presence in the community diminished almost overnight, the confident smile replaced with a brittle defensiveness that no longer inspired crowds but instead left her isolated, muttered about in half-sympathetic, half-condemning tones at the local diner. For Michael, the process of repair was both physical and symbolic. He replaced shattered locks, reinforced the cracked beam with new oak, and spent long hours sweeping, sanding, and scrubbing away the remnants of spilled alcohol until the wood smelled of cedar oil instead of stale beer. The legal path, too, reached its conclusion with quiet authority rather than drama. Claire secured not only recognition of his ownership, but also a restitution order that forced the so-called trust to cover damages. A victory not of spectacle, but of persistence, and in that victory Michael found a steadier ground than applause could have given. Neighbors who had once stood uncertainly on the sidelines began to drift back toward him, some offering apologies, others simply lending a hand with repairs. And though Michael remained by nature a solitary man, he accepted their presence, not as an obligation, but as a sign that the false narrative Karen had woven had finally unraveled. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and lit the barn in soft amber, he unlocked the great doors and stood within the cavernous space now cleared of debris, imagining again the rows of workbenches and the delicate ticking of clocks he had always meant to restore. And in that vision he felt not only the return of his sanctuary, but also a quiet resilience that came from knowing he had faced erasure and endured. The barn was his, scarred but steadfast, and in its silence he heard not absence but possibility, the measured rhythm of a life that, against all efforts to take it from him, was still his to shape.